this video, we'll be making Coyotas, which has over time become a very popular pastry out of the state of Sonora in northwest Mexico, which is where I'm from. But they were originally particular only to one neighborhood, and it was really its own municipality for a long time, called Villa de Seris. And this is right in the center of Hermosillo. It's the oldest part of Hermosillo, and right near where I lived when I was a kid. So there were only, a couple of, when I lived there, when I was in the 80s, there were only really like one or two places that were known for making these pastries. They are, in essence, a flat empanada, flat round empanada. And so between the two layers, the two tortillas, it's stuffed with grated piloncillo. And so when it's baked, everything, the piloncillo, which we'll talk about what that is becomes this sort of caramel, and there are these deliciously fragrant pastries that are baked in a mesquite wood-fired oven. And so between the caramel of the piloncillo and the mesquite essence that gets attached to them, they're just a wonderful, fragrant, flaky pastry. But sometime in the 90s, the Coyotas sort of just exploded, late 90s. And so the bakeries making them started spreading throughout the entire Villa de Seris neighborhood, and then the city, and then the entire state of Sonora. So they've now become very well known, even though when we lived there, it was really, if you lived in the Villa de Seris neighborhood, or crossed through there quite a bit, then you knew these pastries. They have quite an interesting history as well. So we'll talk about that while we are making them. And so now I'm going to get my view set up so that we can see what I'm doing and making the dough. So we're going to make the dough in the same way a lot of doughs are made. We're going to cut our lard, our fat. Lard is going to be our fat in this dough. Into our flour. First, I'm going to go ahead and have 500 grams of flour. I'm going to add 1.5 teaspoons of dry active yeast, and I'm going to mix those two together. Okay, now I have 250 grams of lard. That seems like a lot, and that's okay. So in the original recipe of these pastries, it called for vegetable shortening. I don't really like the flavor of vegetable shortening, and I prefer to use lard. So here I'm just pinching the lard into the flour. Okay, you don't have to be as super delicate about it as you would be with butter. Lard is not going to melt as easily as butter. And I made a syrup earlier from piloncillo and water. And so I'm going to add this in to my dough. First I'm going to add a pinch of salt. Okay, I didn't add my salt right away because you want to sort of establish the yeast into the flour first. Okay, my syrup I've gone ahead and cooled to 110 degrees. You want to make sure you don't add a hot liquid to yeast, or you're going to kill it. Okay, I'm using a spoon because I don't feel like coating my hands in wet sugar water. Now we've incorporated that liquid into the dough. If the dough feels dry, which this one does not, but if it feels dry, you might need to add just a little bit more water. I usually recommend adding just a little bit at a time. This dough might actually be just a little bit wet, so I'm going to get some flour into my hands and scrape everything out into the table so I can mix it up just a little bit better. You're not really kneading it very much. just enough to make sure I'm incorporating everything together, okay? And I don't have any bits of flour that hasn't been touched by that piloncillo syrup, okay? So I got out one of my favorite tools, which is a flexible bowl scraper, which I use to scrape my bowl clean. Unfortunately, that was done a video. My video decided to stop recording. I brought my dough back together, okay? And I'm just making sure, you know, again, everything is nice and smooth. There's a little piece of piloncillo in there that wasn't melted. I'm gonna still leave it in there because that's just going to add more flavor. So I use my flexible bowl scraper to get everything clean from my counter. My dough is going to go in the bowl. I'm gonna cover it and we're gonna let it rest for about an hour. That's going to allow the yeast in the dough to start activating, to start working. See, I'm gonna get the dough that I left in my spoon and put it in here because I don't like wasting food, okay? So our yeast is going to activate, our gluten is going to relax and become nice and soft, and that gives us a chance to grate our piloncillo. We're going to talk about what piloncillo is, and this is my both most favorite and most disliked part of this recipe. This is piloncillo. In case you are not familiar, it's one of my favorite Mexican ingredients, okay? It's not particular to Mexico, but it's used there more than anywhere else. So it's a lump raw sugar cone that's made with the caramelized juice out of sugar cane, okay? And it has all the molasses and all the minerals still in it, so it's actually, you know, has some nutritional value as opposed to like a refined sugar. It's also incredibly hard. There are recipes that calls for you to break apart your piloncillo with a hammer. It's kind of fun to write. I don't always do it. If I'm making a syrup, I just throw it in whole. So anyway, in order to get this into a small enough size to fill your coyota, you have to grate it. You can either use a very fine grater or this one. So it's a lot of grating. When you're done grating them, you need to coat just add a little bit of flour, like a teaspoon really per cone should be enough, and just mix it in. Otherwise that sugar is going to really stick together. Done with my grating. I only grated 2 piloncillo cones and really only about 2/3 of the way through. So usually when I'm grating, and then once I get to the point where it's uncomfortable to hold, I turn it over and keep grating that way. I love it when I can see that little you know, cavity inside from when the hot caramelized sugar syrup is poured into the molds upside down, and sometimes it forms a little bubble. So grated 2, I could keep going, but I feel like I'm okay with this amount of sugar that I have here. Also, my arm's starting to hurt. And, you know, definitely keep these, because next time I'm making piloncillo syrup, I just weigh these, see how much it is, and use those instead of using a new cone. So the dough still needs to rest, my arm needs to rest, and then we'll keep going. What happened here with my dough is that I tried to start portioning and then rolling out, and I found that my discs of dough were actually breaking. So I had not added enough moisture to my dough. The sugar syrup is going to make it a little bit fragile and likely to tear unless there's enough moisture in it. So I worked in a little bit more water into the dough. Okay, the dough should feel tacky, but your hand should come away cleanly from it. So I added 3 tablespoons of water, which is what the recipe says to do. So I should have followed my own recipe rather than thinking I knew what I should do. Okay, so since I've been kneading this and added that water, I'm going to go ahead and let it rest for about 15 minutes. And then I'm going to start portioning and rolling, filling, and eventually baking my coyotas. When it comes to portioning the dough, my favorite way to do so is make an L, make an L, and with that, pinch the dough. Tend to be pretty accurate at maintaining size, and of course I say that right as I pull one that's larger, okay? But you can get fairly consistent with practice. So I'm only going to portion a few. I'm going to need one more. And, roll them out smooth. This one maybe just a tiny bit small. So I'm going to roll it out smooth. And I just dust my flour, dust my surface with flour. For this particular pastry, for the Coyota, I like to use this small dowel rolling pin, which is actually for Chinese dumplings. But it works particularly well for this pastry. Okay, so I have this rolled out to where I want it. And I have one that I had rolled out just a little bit earlier. And so I'm going to do my piloncillo filling. You're adding less than a tablespoon of filling, making sure you leave some clear all around. Okay, and I'm going to now press these two edges together. You don't have to do anything in particular to get the edges to stick. This is a fairly moist dough, so it's going to stick on its own as it's baking, and I sort of just tap my fingertip all around. It leaves a little bit of a decorative pattern. You don't have to score it with with a fork or anything like that. But I do like to cut some vent holes, or you need to cut some vent holes. And I primarily just do with a paring knife, little cross. Okay, so I'm going to keep working on rolling and then filling my pastry. It is a fairly delicate dough, so try to make sure you don't poke your fingers through it or it will make a hole. Again, if it's not particularly round right away, well, you can also just slightly stretch, but see, I poked a little hole in this one. There, my about tablespoon of piloncillo, grated piloncillo. Stretching out that top to fit, pressing them together. And leaving my little decorative fingertip marking and cutting my scores. There's some bakeries in Hermosillo, or in the Villa de Seris in Hermosillo, that cut out a circle at top. I don't really like that because the piloncillo or the filling tends to spill out on top, so I don't really think it's a great look. So let's talk about the piloncillo that we used earlier. It can occasionally be hard to find in stores or find good quality piloncillo because there are some that are unfortunately made with corn syrup. And so they don't have the same kind of scent or color or flavor. So, definitely in Mexican grocery stores, you can find it. You can find it also online. I sort of feel like I should establish a service where, like, tell me, and tell me what you need, and I will mail it to you. It's like establish a piloncillo mail-in service, and this is something I have done for friends before. But piloncillo does have a very particular flavor and fragrance. If you can't find it, you can substitute for one cone. It's about 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar and
dark brown sugar, packed, and 1 tablespoon of unsulfured molasses, like a really good quality unsulfured molasses. Okay. And if you were to use that as a filling, I would mix that brown sugar in little bits of molasses at a time until you get the right kind of consistency. Or you could just use straight brown sugar. So as Coyotas gained in popularity and they were found in more and more parts of the city, then and this was in the 1990s, then different fillings started to be used. Another one that became very popular is jamoncillo. Jamoncillo is a milk fudge, typical of the state of Sonora, and usually contains pecans. So that's a really popular one. Another sort of artisanal product that's popular and very typical of the state of Sonora is ate de membrillo or dulce de membrillo. And that is a quince paste. If you've never had quince paste, it's absolutely delicious. And it's a very seasonal product since quince are only harvested once a year in the fall. If you are familiar with the town of Magdalena de Quino, some of the quince paste made in that area is just absolutely fantastic. There's a festival at the end of, or mid-October, I believe. I forget when exactly. So I'm gonna get one more rolled one made, and then we're gonna try out the tortilla press. If you are like me and are not a big fan of the rolling pin, then you can actually make these with a tortilla press. Normally, this is used mostly for corn tortillas, although you can use it for whole wheat tortillas since the dough tends to be a lot stiffer. So we are going to do our coyotas on this press. I'm going to make them a little bit smaller, okay? So this is definitely the size of a little bit smaller than a golf ball, okay? And we have my handy tortilla liners in here, or tortilla press liners. And I've been using the same ones for probably at least 5 years. I just make sure that I wash them between uses. Okay, I'm gonna coat just a little bit of flour on, I say a little bit of flour and dump it straight in there. Little bit of flour on my coyota here. And light press. Then I'm going to give it a turn. Okay, 180. Oh, I'm gonna rearrange my plastic here. 180-degree flip, then press, little wiggle, bring it back. Okay, then you just have to be careful when you are taking the plastic off. Usually on these in particular, when I'm taking the plastic off, I put it down flat and then take the plastic off. So now, as long as your portion sizes are the same, you have perfectly round, so cute coyotas. Okay, next one. Want to make sure you don't over press so that you don't get too thin. So we're doing 2 different sizes of coyotas. The cute little boutique ones over here. The larger, I despise the word rustic, so I'm not going to use it. The more traditional size ones, okay? I'm really not that much of a traditionalist when it comes to a lot of foods, but coyotas I very much am. Whenever I happen to be in Hermosillo, which is nowhere near often enough for my taste, I have to go specifically to Doña Maria to get coyotas. This was, the place where we would get them. Primarily, it was one of 2 places where we would get them when I lived in Hermosillo, but it's the one that I remember the most. And those are the ones that, to me, taste specifically right. That is what a coyota should be. But the history of the coyotas is kind of interesting because there's this sort of very benign kind of divisiveness over coyotas. Everybody has their particular place that they have to get them from, much like myself, and they will swear up and down that that's the best place and every other place is garbage. Okay, and so, like I mentioned earlier, there is a specific family that Coyotas are related to, and that is the Ibarra family. So the woman that is credited with the invention of Coyotas is not Doña Maria, but it is her neighbor, Agustina Ibarra, and she was from a Spanish descendant family that were cattle ranchers in Villa de Seris and thereabouts. And it may or may not have been influenced by something that one of the Seri, the native women that worked for the family, taught them, the indigenous woman. But there's a lot of this divisiveness in coyoterias, like I've said, and preference for. And so there seems to be this interesting rift in between people that support Doña Maria, and then perhaps others that support coyoterias that are owned and operated by the descendants of this particular family, of the Ibarra, and as well as the descendants of who seems to have been an adoptive son of Doña Agustina. So there's an interesting amount of divisiveness over this innocuous little pastry that up until the 1990s was very, very localized in just a particular Villa de Seris neighborhood. And the Villa de Seris was established really as a settlement community for the Seri people. And so because of that, it's a very insular little town, and it's very set in maintaining the traditions of the town, which Coyota being one of them, which is also why people take so much pride and so much pride into their Coyota of choice, myself included. Now, what I like to do today is actually, and I don't know why I had not thought about it, other than maybe I don't make these as much as I should, is I'm going to cook them in the grill outside. And I wish I had thought about doing it in a mesquite grill sooner, because that way I could have gotten the coals ready. But I'm going to cook them in the gas grill. But one of the main differences between the coyotas that I make and the coyotas that are made in Villa de Seris is that those are cooked in big, sometimes very, very large mesquite wood-fired ovens. And those ovens are made of stone or made of concrete, and so they retain a lot more heat than your regular home oven is going to retain. So, the coyotas get these wonderful little darker brown spots, more golden spots that you don't get in a home oven unless you're going to, of course, burn your coyota, and nobody wants a burnt coyota. But I'm going to try doing it in the gas grill outside, and perhaps next time, or I'll get myself some extra time and do an experiment with the mesquite grill, which would give it that mesquite smoke component that is missing. So I'm going to finish these up before they go into the oven or the grill this time. They need to rest. So I'm going to let them rest for about 15 minutes. And then they go into the oven. The ones that have come out of my regular oven, I'll bring one out right here. You definitely want to make sure you cook them long enough until you see that little bit of caramelization happening right there. You should be able to open the oven, get a full whiff of piloncillo smoke, and then you should be able to see those little bits of bubbling, which, like I said, is why I don't like having a big opening here. Then the piloncillo, depending on if you went a little crazy on your filling, might have spilled over. But I'm gonna crack into it. And it should be a soft pastry still. It shouldn't be so hard. And you should have the filling. I could have gone a little bit more crazy with the filling, but I like to make sure there's a nice balance between the dough itself and the piloncillo. And it's fragrant and soft and just so wonderful. It's just missing that smoke flavor. So overall, cooking them in the grill didn't make a huge amount of difference other than that it gave me that beautiful brown bottom, which is one of the things I was looking for. I wish there had been more color on the surface, but that's something that I'm going to work on. Otherwise, this is what happens when you only have one portion, and this is still warm, which is why it's falling apart, so I should probably stop playing with it. That's what happens when you only have one portion of dough left. Just make a little empanada. This one has a flat edge because I had it pushed up against a sheet tray so it wouldn't touch the other ones. But thank you so much for joining me for this journey through Sonoran sweets with Ponteduros and Coyotas, not from Hermosillo, not from Sonora, but specifically from Villa de Seris. Thank you so much.